All right, everyone, get ready, because today we're diving deep, really deep, into the EU's new competitiveness compass. It's a big one, but don't worry, we're here to break it down.
Yeah, it's a hefty policy document.
We've got our hands on the latest EU communications and fact sheets. They're fresh off the press.
Straight from the source.
And we're going to distill all of that for you into some key takeaways, the stuff you really need to know.
So you can really grasp what this policy is all about
Yeah.
and why it should matter to you.
Exactly. So first things first.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is this compass, and why is the EU suddenly so obsessed with competitiveness?
Well, it's like the EU is taking a good, hard look in the mirror, having a bit of an economic reality check.
Oh, is that what's going on?
They're acknowledging all the good stuff they've got going for them.
Like what?
Skilled workers, strong capital markets, and of course, the massive single market.
That's a big one.
Right. It's like a giant free trade zone within the EU. But there's this nagging problem they can't seem to shake, a productivity gap, especially when you compare them to the US and China.
So they've got all the pieces, but they're not quite firing on all cylinders.
That's a great way to put it. And they're calling out some pretty specific concerns in these documents. They're saying they're not turning research into actual products as effectively as they could be.
Okay, so they've got the brains, but...
But the ideas aren't becoming reality. They're also dealing with some pretty high energy prices, regulations that some see as a burden, and, a global playing field that doesn't always feel level.
Right. And I'm guessing this isn't just some abstract debate among economists. This has real-world implications.
So absolutely. This is about investment, jobs, and even Europe's position on the global stage.
It's about their future.
Exactly, and that's where the compass comes in. This is their strategy, their roadmap for navigating these challenges and making sure Europe can stay competitive in the decades to come.
Okay, so less of a compass and more of a roadmap.
Yeah, I guess you could say that.
So walk us through it. What's the route this compass is charting? What's the big picture here?
Well, at the heart of it are three big ideas, three transformational imperatives. They call them that in the document. Think of them as the guiding stars for a more competitive Europe.
Okay, lay it on us.
Yeah.
What are these guiding stars?
First up, we've got closing the innovation gap. Basically, they want to make Europe the place where those game-changing ideas become reality.
So turning those research papers into actual products and services that people use, right?
Exactly. Then there's decarbonization and competitiveness.
That sounds like a tough one.
It is. They're basically trying to prove that going green can actually be a driver of growth, not a burden.
So green and competitive, not green or competitive.
Precisely. And lastly, we've got reducing dependencies and increasing security. It's about making sure Europe can thrive in a world that's becoming increasingly, how do I put this?
Unpredictable.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. A bit volatile,
Volatile is putting it mildly.
So yeah, three massive challenges, but also potentially some big opportunities if they can pull it off.
I like the challenges A&D opportunities. All right, well, let's take a closer look at each of these imperatives, starting with closing that innovation gap. What exactly is the problem they're trying to solve here?
Well, Europe has brilliant researchers, amazing universities, but they haven't been as good at turning those great ideas into, commercial successes.
There's lots of potential.
But not enough follow-through.
They're not launching enough successful startups.
Exactly. And even the ones that do manage to take off, they often hit a wall when they try to grow within the EU. They call it a scale-up gap.
So you've got these innovative companies ready to take off,
But something's holding them back.
And what's the impact of that?
Well, think about venture capital. Only a tiny fraction, like 5%, of global venture capital is raised in the EU.
Seriously?
Yeah.
That little?
Yeah, it's pretty stark when you compare it to the US, where they attract a whopping 52%. It's like they're playing in a completely different league. Imagine all those brilliant European minds, all those great ideas that might end up going elsewhere because they can't get the funding they need right here in Europe.
So a brain drain of sorts.
Exactly, and that's something the EU is trying to address.
Okay, so what's the plan? How are they hoping to close this innovation gap? Give us some details.
Well, they've got a few ideas up their sleeve.
I'm all ears.
First off, they're launching a new EU startup and scale-up strategy. Think of it as clearing the runway for those innovative businesses to take off.
Love that analogy.
They're also looking at something called a 28th regime for innovative companies.
A 28th regime? What on earth is that?
So there are 27 countries in the EU, right?
Right.
This would basically create a single set of rules for these innovative companies, no matter where they're based in the EU. No more having to navigate 27 different sets of regulations, no more conflicting standards.
So one rule book for all. That sounds pretty ambitious.
It is, but you're talking about digital infrastructure.
Exactly. The digital superhighways that allow all this innovation to travel at lightning speed. What's the plan there?
While the EU knows they need to catch up, they're lagging behind on some of their own targets for digital infrastructure.
So they're playing catch up.
They are, and that's why they're proposing this Digital Networks Act to encourage more investment in things like fiber optic networks, 6G technology, and cloud computing.
So basically, they're trying to lay the groundwork for a more digital, more innovative future.
Exactly. But it's not just about the technology itself, it's also about the people who use it.
Which is where their Union of Skills initiative comes in.
Exactly. Making sure people have the right skills to thrive in this rapidly evolving digital economy.
It's all connected, isn't it? The
Yeah.
investment, the infrastructure, the skills it all needs to work together.
That's the whole idea behind the compass, really. Taking a holistic approach, recognizing that competitiveness isn't just about one policy or one sector, it's about all these different elements working together in harmony.
Like an orchestra.
Exactly. And now, let's turn our attention to that second imperative, decarbonization and competitiveness. How can they possibly achieve both of those goals at the same time? It's tricky, right? Trying to go green and stay competitive in a global economy.
It sounds like a tough balancing act.
It is, but the EU thinks they've found the answer.
And what's that?
They call it the Clean Industrial Deal.
All right, tell us more about this deal.
Well, it's all about making sure that Europe remains a manufacturing powerhouse, but UT, a green one, they want to be leaders in clean technology.
So not just buying green products, but actually making them in Europe.
Exactly. They're aiming to create what they call lead markets for clean technologies.
Lead markets.
Yeah, basically, they want to be the place to go for these technologies. So they're proposing a mix of incentives for companies, regulations to set high environmental standards, and strategic investments to support research and development.
Okay, so creating an environment where it makes sense for businesses to invest in green technology. But what are some of the specific things they're proposing? Give us some concrete examples.
One big focus is clean energy, making it more affordable and accessible to everyone. They're calling it the Affordable Energy Action Plan.
Catchy title.
Right. It's about simplifying energy tariffs, promoting things like long-term power purchase agreements, and investing in a smarter, more efficient energy grid.
Makes sense. If energy is expensive, it's hard for businesses to stay competitive, especially those industries that use a lot of energy.
Exactly. And they're especially focused on those energy-intensive industries like steel, chemicals, cement, sectors that are really hard to decarbonize. They're actually developing specific action plans for them.
Oh, so they're acknowledging that a one-size-fits-all approach won't work.
Right. Different industries have different needs, different challenges when it comes to going green.
Okay, so tailored solutions. What else?
Well, there's this big worry they have about carbon leakage.
Carbon leakage.
Yeah, it's basically the fear that if Europe raises its environmental standards but other countries don't, companies will just move their production elsewhere.
So Europe goes green, but the jobs and the emissions just move somewhere else.
Exactly. And that wouldn't be good for anyone, right?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
So how are they planning to prevent that?
They're looking at this thing called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism.
Okay, that sounds complicated.
It is a bit complex, but the basic idea is to put a price on the carbon emissions embedded in imported goods.
So if you want to sell your stuff in Europe, you got to play by Europe's rules.
Exactly. It's about creating a level playing field and making sure that companies operating in Europe aren't at a disadvantage because they're doing the right thing, environmentally speaking.
So making sure that going green isn't a competitive disadvantage.
Right. And it's not just about heavy industry. They're also looking at sustainable transportation with their new Sustainable Transport Investment Plan. They want to invest in electric vehicle charging infrastructure, promote renewable fuels.
Getting those gas guzzlers off the road.
Exactly. And don't forget about the circular economy.
Ah, yes, the Circular Economy Action Plan. We're big fans of that one.
It's a good one, right? All about reducing waste, reusing materials, and moving away from that take, make, dispose model that's so unsustainable.
So they're really looking at the whole system and trying to make it more sustainable.
They are. It's a huge undertaking, but they seem committed to making it happen.
Well, we've covered innovation and decarbonization. That brings us to that third imperative, reducing dependencies and increasing security. which feels especially relevant these days with everything that's going on in the world.
It's definitely top of mind for a lot of people, and the EU is taking it very seriously.
So what's the plan? How do they plan to make Europe more resilient in a world that feels increasingly uncertain?
Well, one key strategy is diversifying their trading partners. They're looking to build what they call clean trade and investment partnerships. Yeah, it's not just about free trade for the sake of free trade. These are partnerships with countries they can rely on, countries that share their values, and that are committed to sustainability.
So being more strategic about who they do business with.
Exactly. But it's not just about looking outward, it's also about strengthening Europe's own internal capabilities. Remember that joint purchasing platform for critical raw materials we talked about earlier?
Vaguely.
It's about giving Europe more leverage when it comes to negotiating with suppliers and reducing their reliance on any single country.
Strength in numbers.
Exactly. And they're also focusing on specific sectors that are really vulnerable to disruptions, like pharmaceuticals, for example.
Right, because if another pandemic hits and you're relying on some other country for essential medicines, you're in big trouble.
You are. That's why they're pushing for things like the Critical Medicines Act, which aims to boost domestic production of those essential medicines so they're not so dependent on foreign suppliers.
So it's about thinking ahead, anticipating potential problems, and having backup plans.
Exactly. And this whole focus on resilience goes beyond just the economy. They're also thinking about the bigger geopolitical picture.
Right, because you can't be a strong economic power if you're not secure.
Precisely. And that's why they're calling for greater defense cooperation among EU countries, more investment in defense research and development, and a more strategic approach to building up those key defense capabilities.
So it's about being able to stand on their own 2 feet in a world that feels increasingly unstable.
Exactly. And it's not just about traditional military defense either. It's about cybersecurity, preparing for hybrid threats, building resilience to climate change. It's a very comprehensive approach to security.
Wow, they're really trying to cover all the bases, aren't they?
They are. They recognize that in today's world, threats can come from anywhere, and that security isn't just about building walls. It's about working together, innovating, and finding solutions to common problems.
Okay, so we've covered the 3 main imperatives: closing the innovation gap, decarbonizing the economy, and reducing dependencies. That's a lot of ground we've covered.
It is. And the EU's got a lot on their plate.
They do, but the message seems pretty clear. You're not just sitting back and watching the world go by. They're taking a proactive approach to shaping their own future.
Exactly. They're determined to make Europe more competitive on the global stage, and they're willing to try new things to get there.
And they're not doing it alone, right? They're calling for collaboration from businesses, researchers, and even everyday citizens.
Absolutely. They see this as a collective effort.
Well, that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive into the EU's competitiveness compass. But there's one more piece of this puzzle that we need to explore, and that's how they plan to actually coordinate all these efforts. Because it's one thing to have all these great ideas, but it's another thing to actually put them into practice.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Welcome back for the final part of our deep dive into this EU competitiveness compass. We've talked about, I think, almost everything by now. The 3 main imperatives, the 5 horizontal enablers,
A lot of specific actions, right?
and tons of new initiatives. But now it's time to talk about the glue that holds it all together.
The coordination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How does the EU plan to actually make all of this happen?
Well, they're realizing, I think, that boosting competitiveness isn't something you can do in isolation.
Right. It's not just about one country going it alone or one policy.
Exactly. It's about having a more, what they call holistic approach, a joined-up approach.
So it's like you can have all the best musicians in the world, but if they're not playing together,
You don't get a symphony.
right, you just get noise.
And that's where this new competitiveness coordination tool comes in.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue.
So what is it? In a nutshell.
Think of it as a platform for collaboration, a way to get everyone on the same page. The EU, the member states, they're all going to be working together to figure out the priorities, come up with joint action plans, and coordinate investments.
Okay, so less top-down, more teamwork?
Exactly. And it's not just about good intentions either. They're putting some real money behind this.
Ah, money. Now you're speaking my language. Tell me more.
Well, they're setting up this new competitiveness fund to support all these collaborative efforts. It's going to finance strategic projects, help de-risk investments, basically create incentives for everyone to align their policies with the overall EU strategy.
So it's like putting your money where your mouth is.
Exactly. And they're not just starting from scratch either. They're building on things that have already worked, like the Strategic Technologies for Europe platform, which has shown how valuable it can be to coordinate funding across different programs.
Okay, so they've got the tool, they've got the fund. Where are they going to start?
Well, initially they're going to focus on a few pilot projects in areas where there's a clear benefit to working together at a European level.
Okay, so test runs, beta versions.
Yeah, you could say that. And these pilot areas will likely be things like energy infrastructure, transport infrastructure.
Digital infrastructure.
Oh, of course, digital infrastructure. They're also looking at artificial intelligence and key manufacturing capacities.
Like those critical medicines we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Areas where it just makes more sense to pool your resources and tackle the challenges together.
Makes sense. So, ambitious plans, lots of money on the table, but how will they actually make sure this all works? How do you measure progress when you have so many different actors involved?
Well, they're planning to use the existing European semester process as a way to monitor and evaluate progress.
So it's like a, what, like a regular checkup?
Yeah, kinda. It's an annual thing where the EU reviews member states' economic and fiscal policies, gives them recommendations and whatnot.
Okay, so it's built into the system,
Mm.
and they'll also be using their annual single market and competitiveness report to track how they're doing on those bigger goals.
Right. Transparency and accountability. But let's be real, this whole competitiveness coordination tool is a pretty massive experiment.
It is. It's a bold move, and there's no guarantee it's going to work. I mean, let's face it, getting 27 countries to agree on anything, especially something this complex,
It's a challenge.
that's an understatement.
But, the EU has a history of pulling off these seemingly impossible feats.
Like,
The euro, for example, that was a huge undertaking.
yeah, creating a single currency for so many different countries with their different economies,
Mm.
that was no small feat.
And they did it. The Erasmus program, too.
True. Sending students all across Europe to study in different countries, that's been a huge success.
Exactly. So they have shown they can cooperate and achieve big things when they put their minds to it. And the potential payoff here is huge.
Right, if they can truly make this compass work.
If they can make collaboration the rule and not the exception, it could be a total game changer for Europe.
Not just for their economy, but for their place in the world.
Absolutely. And it's not just about GDP or trade balances. It's about creating a more resilient Europe, a more sustainable Europe, a more prosperous Europe for everyone.
Well said. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I don't know, I'm feeling cautiously optimistic. This competitiveness compass is ambitious, it's complex, there are no guarantees. But the EU seems determined to take charge of its own destiny.
And they recognize that they can't do it alone. They need everyone on board: governments, businesses, researchers, citizens.
It's a collective effort.
Hmm.
And that's what makes it so interesting. It's not just a policy document, it's a statement of intent. It's a vision for the future of Europe.
And it'll be fascinating to see how it all plays out in the years to come.
Absolutely. So everyone, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged in the big conversations that are shaping our world. Until next time, happy exploring.